All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go over the process by which you're going to make your enemy discover your character and then turn and follow your character. Now, this isn't the most complicated code possible. There are obviously a lot more. And this also is not going to do any animation. So if your character's got legs or something like that, this is not going to do any animations to have them walking or whatever. It's just basically going to have them slide over to your character and follow the terrain too. So that's one thing that I had to work on a lot, was getting them to follow the terrain. Also, they'll move around trees. They'll do collision avoidance. They'll move around buildings, that sort of stuff. Now, the part of this that we're not going to do, but we will add later, is what's called line of sight. And line of sight means that you can hide behind objects. So, for instance, I'm standing in front of this brick house here, right? And if my enemy is on the other side of the house, the way we're going to do it today, he'll still see me, even if his back is turned to me, and even if I'm hiding behind something. Our next step is going to be to actually add a line of sight to your character, so that, or to the enemy, so that if the enemy's back is turned to you, or if you're hiding behind an object, you won't be seen. So that'll be really cool, and it's actually not that hard. The code is pretty easy. I just need to integrate it into the code that I've already written, and that's the hard part, but I'll sort that out. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to place an enemy object over here. So I'm going to go into my assets, and I'm going to go into my enemy character, and I have actually several enemy things, and this is the one that actually has the animations, I think, to it. In fact, if I even go to animations, I think I can play. So I've got the animations all set up for my guy, but we're just going to have to call them. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and we're going to make an enemy a prefab again. So I'm just going to go create, and I'm going to create a prefab in my enemy, and I'm just going to call this enemy prefab. Okay, just nice and simple. I'm going to take my enemy, and I'm going to drag him into that there, just like that. Okay, and then I can take this prefab and I'm just going to drag it over here. Now he's pretty big, so that's one of the first things that I might want to do, is match him up to the size of my character. So, get him to be, I don't know, let's see, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. That's way too small. So how about 0.75, 0.75, 0.75. That's still a little big. So how about 0.5? And it doesn't really matter. That'll be good enough. Okay. So now, what we're going to do is first things first. We're going to work on our guy here. We're going to click Add Component. Okay. And the first component that we're going to add is under Physics. We're going to add a spherical collider. Okay, so there's a sphere collider. And the first thing that I want to do is, you can barely see it down here underneath his feet. So I'm going to take the radius, I'm going to make it like 5. Okay, now I can see it a little bit better. And now I'm going to move the center of that radius up until it's approximately in the center of the enemy's body. It doesn't have to be exact, but it has to be pretty darn close. That way, or else this won't work. So I'm just going to take the y-axis and I'm going to move it up. Let's try 2. Nope. 5. That looks pretty good. And so this is going to be a collision trigger. And so I'm going to check the is trigger button here. And what this does is essentially it's going to set this sphere as the distance at which my enemy is going to be able to see my character, my first person character. So I set it for like 125. Okay? And that's pretty big. So let's set it for 100. Okay? We can even go a little bit less. Say 90. And that's going to be basically the distance at which he sees my character. So that is what we call trigger, and that's why it's really important that this is trigger is checked. If you don't do that, then this will not work, okay? Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to add a rigid body component to this, okay, as well. And then we want to make sure that use gravity is turned on because we want him to walk along the terrain, so we don't want him to fly, unless your enemy is a flying enemy, in which case you probably don't want gravity checked on. And then the other thing that's important is to hit the freeze position and the freeze rotation to check these on. Let's see if what happens to him. I think if I hit this, he'll fall over. Whoops. Yep, he fell. See, he fell right through. Okay, so we'll let's drag this down here. Let's play that again. Actually, he went straight through the terrain. Okay, so watch, he's just going to fall right through. And there's a couple reasons for that. So we'll continue on, and then we'll go back to this freeze rotation thing. I'll show you why I want to do that. So next, we're going to add a nav mesh agent. Now I forget where it is, so I just always search nav, and there's the nav mesh agent. Okay, and we're going to zoom in on our character again, and you can see that there's a new little green set of wire frames here. Okay, that's really, really small. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the base offset to like 2. Oh, no, that goes the other way. So like -2. -3, and we want to get that just about in the middle, and then I'm going to set the radius to like 1.25. Now it'll be different for everybody's different enemy characters, okay? So don't just do the numbers. There's a reason why in your instructions I haven't given you numbers. It's all based upon the sizes that you started things at, and that's relative to your world. So you want to be, and it's also relative to the character, the size of the prefab, so we want to be careful about that. So now I'll set the height to like 5, no, 7, how about 8? I want it to look like it's the same height as my enemy. Now I'm going to take my base offset back down, -2, -1, -0.75. And I want it to basically be resting on the ground. And going all the way up to his head. There we go. So now my nav mesh agent is, and this is basically this is going to figure out avoidance for objects like trees and stuff like that. So that's a pretty cool feature there. So now that we've got the nav mesh agent and we've got the rigid body, we've got that all the same. Now we need to go over to my enemy prefab, and I'm going to open it up right here in the hierarchy. And then here I'm going to find the mesh of my object. So it's called plane. And if you're not sure, you can open up your prefab and it will show you where it is right there. So I'm going to add another component to the mesh, and it's another collider. And this is actually really important because this is why he's falling through the ground right now, is because the spherical collider that we have is really big, and so it's already through the terrain, so it feels like he's kind of already underneath it. It's not going to help him with gravity and such. So we're going to add, let's get rid of the search there, a capsule collider for my mesh. Now in order to get the sizing correct for this, what I usually do is I'll make it really skinny, like 0.01, okay? And now you can see that it's actually really long and really skinny right here. And I'll leave it the height to 1, or you can even go like 0.5. And you'll see it's going sideways. And that's partially because we're using Blender, and Blender, the axes are inverted, or not inverted, but different. So Z is the vertical axis in Blender, and Y is the vertical axis in Unity. So that's why sometimes things come in sideways. So what we're going to do is it has a directional controller here where we're just going to choose the Z axis. And now you can see that my capsule collider is a lot taller. So now I'm going to set my radius to be about the width of his body. So let's add, 0.15. That looks good. And I'm going to start dealing with my height, 0.02. And then I can move the center up, 0.25. Oh, that's way too high. 0.1. 0.05. There we go. Get it to be about the middle, and then I can start taking my height back again and get this to basically be about the height of the character. There we go. And you want it to rest right at the bottom of his feet too, so 0.045, 0.48. That looks pretty good. So now this collider is going to allow him to rest. So now this should be actually pretty funny. I'm going to save really quickly here. Save my scene and save my project. I'm not sure what that error was. We're going to ignore it. So now if I hit play, he's going to wobble and topple over. Okay? Because he's in a capsule collider, and then he's just going to start rolling, which is actually really kind of funny. We don't want this, okay? And this is where we can change that in the rigid body collider that we put on the prefab. So if I click on the hierarchy to the prefab here, it says freeze rotation. So I'm pretty sure it's X and Z for most people. So let's test that now. And see, now he doesn't fall over. So that's a so if your guy's falling over, it's in the rigid body is what's going to happen there. So now, believe it or not, we're actually getting pretty close to being set to go. So we've added the capsule collider, we've added the spherical collider, which is our trigger, okay, for our code. Now we're ready to make a new script. So you're going to go to the My Scripts thing, and let me collapse some of these, the rigid body and the spherical collider and the nav mesh agent. So now we're going to open up your My Scripts folder, okay, and you're going to right click and you're going to create a new script, JavaScript, which is going to be called, let's see here, I called it simple enemy script. You should call it enemy follow, okay, and I'll change the name of mine here, but you take a look at it. I've copied and pasted the code for you into the following pages, and you'll also see that I've got a lot of notes in the code for you on your pages that explain something. So here's some things about the code that are really important, and maybe we'll pick this apart in a little bit of a little later time as far as what's happening. But first, we're going to declare, and this is the really important one, this is a static variable called enemy shooting, and it's a Boolean, which means it's true or false. And that static variable means that other codes, other scripts, can read it. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically make a shooter. If your enemy is shooting, okay, you're going to place an empty game object on your enemy, okay, just like we did our first-person shooter, and then that script is going to be looking for this variable to be true. And if it's false, then that means the enemy isn't shooting. If it's true, then that means the enemy is shooting, and then the shooting script will then take care of the actual shooting part. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. So that's what that variable is for. So that variable is really important. Capitals and everything has to be precise. Then we have a variable called player, which is transform. So when we drag this script into our enemy, what's going to happen is that it's going to ask us to define who the player is, what object the player is, and that's our first-person controller. Then we have move speed. This is how fast the enemy is going to move once it finds you. Okay? You want to make the game harder? You can pump that number up. You want to make the game easier? You can slow them down. Then we have max distance or max dist. That variable is where the enemy is going to actually start shooting. So again, I have my capsule trigger set to about 90, right? But I don't want the enemy to start shooting immediately. I want him to start shooting somewhere around, say, here I have it set to 10. I think when I was playing around with it, I set the variable to 25 later on to kind of get it right. And the cool thing is you can change all these variables in the inspector, just like we could our bullet speed and everything else like that on our previous script. So we have minimum distance. Now the minimum distance is the minimum distance that the enemy is going to come to you. So you don't want the enemy usually to come right up on you. He's going to want to stop. And so the distance there is 5. That's a pretty good one. You can increase or decrease that, so on and so forth. And then lastly, we have another variable called player sighted, and that's another true false boolean. So the function awake happens when the program starts, and I'm setting my 2 booleans, whether the player has been sighted and if the enemy is shooting, both to false. So immediately both those are set to false. Then we have an update function, and this update function constantly runs. It updates every, I don't know how many times a second it's updating, okay? But it's update. And there it has a very simple if statement. If the player sighted is true, then the player has been found, okay? It's going to play that function, which is down here, player found, okay? Then we have a function that's on trigger enter. And then it says other collider. So if you have another collider that comes into the collider for our character, then what's going to happen is if that other collider is the player, then it's going to play a sound. And I've added a sound to this that's like a robot powering up, kind of thing. And then he turns, and then he starts coming towards me, and we'll do that. So I haven't added that audio component to my enemy yet, but I've put the code in there for it. If you don't want this, then you can just turn this off. Just // like that, and then it will turn that function off. All right, then on trigger stay. The on trigger enter happens once. When something enters into the collision sphere, it turns that function on, but it only does it once. The on trigger stay repeats constantly. As long as the player is in the collision sphere, it's always going to stay on. So we have if the other collider is the player, then the player sighted equals true. So that's setting that variable to be true. So then in the update function, it's asking if that variable is true, then I'm going to play the player found function. Lastly, we have not lastly, but second to last, we have on trigger exit. This is what happens if the player runs away and gets out of the sphere, the collider sphere. Then it sets both of our booleans back to false, so that when the update function runs as it's running constantly, it will then see that the player sighted is false, and then it will stop following your character. So now, if it's true, it sends it down to the player found. And this is just simple. The look at position is equal to a vector 3, which is the position of the player. And then what it does, and this is important, is I limited it to the y-axis only. And the reason for that is when the guy was coming towards me, it looks at your character at like where the camera is. So as he got closer to me, he started leaning backwards. Okay, and it looked weird. Plus, then the shooting won't be very accurate of your enemy either. It'll just go right over your head, which could be nice, I guess, but you don't really want that. So what I did is I limited the transformation of the prefab, the enemy prefab, only to the y-axis, so that he's only going side to side like this, okay? He's not going to tilt up or down. Does that make sense to everybody, why you don't want him to do that? Now, theoretically, if you had like a flying enemy or something like that, you might not want that, in which case I could help you. I know the code that would work. Actually, all it is you get rid of these first 2 lines. You get rid of all this, and then you just say transform look at, and you type player in there with which is your variable for the player, and then you're done. So it's a little bit simpler. And then here it just says if you're greater than or equal to the minimum distance, you're transforming the position of your enemy to get closer to the position of the character. And then here it says, and then it's moving itself here. And then if you equal the max distance, this is where it starts shooting. So if you're less than or equal to the max distance setting, then you have enemy shooting equals true. So this is where we set our second Boolean, where it says, yes, the enemy is now shooting. And we're going to call that Boolean in a separate script that is on the guns of our enemy so that our enemy can shoot us. Okay? And like I said, we'll deal with that tomorrow. So that's a rundown of the code. So now if I go to my to Unity, I'm going to click on my Enemy Prefab here, and I'm going to drag my script right in there. And you can see now I've got all my variables are listed in the inspector. So in order to get this to work, let's see what happens. I need to take my first-person controller and I need to drag that object into the player variable right there. And now I can change my max distance or whatever, but that's regardless, it doesn't matter. Then when I'm playing, I like to play in this view now, testing code. You'll see where it says player sighted and it's a checkbox. You'll actually see this box check when I move into range. So I don't have any code errors, that's good. And see, now he's turned towards me and he's moving towards me. And he'll stop, and you can see over here, player sighted is checked now. So now if I run and I can get faster than him, I ran faster than him and now I'm out of his collision sphere. He's just going to sit there and wait. And then if I come back in, now he starts moving because I am back to him. Okay? And he will just continue to point at me no matter where I go. Okay? It's pretty funny to watch, actually. Okay? So that's basically it. Now, there's one other thing that that seems to be able to work. So everything should be good. You need to have your rigid body on your first-person controller and everything, but that basically makes it all happen. And then the enemy shooting script is actually also really easy to do and is exactly the same essentially as the first-person controller shooting, except that what it does, and I changed the variables, but under the update, it's looking for if the simple enemy script, okay, so there's a script, and the Boolean enemy shooting equals true, then it starts the function enemy fire. So I did have to reconfigure the shooting script a little bit to get it to work, but essentially, that's perfect. It works great. And I also set it up so it only fires like, I can set it so so the gun fires like every 1 second, every 2 seconds, whatever. I can set a rate of fire, which is pretty cool. So I'll show you guys that tomorrow. But it all works, and my enemy starts to follow me. Now, there's one last thing that's really important to this whole deal. And that is this. And I learned this the hard way, so I don't want you to repeat my mistakes. I have been making all of these changes to the enemy prefab, but the instance of the prefab that is out in the world, out in the scene. If I were to go back to my assets and open up my enemy and click on the prefab, which is, where's the prefab? Ah, there it is, enemy prefab. You'll notice all the components are not there. So all the work I've done only exists on this guy here. However, there's a really cool and one-step thing by which I can transfer all the work I've done to this instance of the prefab here in the scene to the prefab that's in the folder so that I can just drag out my enemies. And that is this, the apply button right here. Just hit apply, boom, okay? And now if I go and I check on my enemy prefab, you'll see it's now got all the components copied to it. So now, all I need to do is I can just drag a whole bunch of these prefabs into different parts of my scene wherever I want these guys to be, and they'll all follow me. And it's cool to watch them go through the trees too. So let's just do this. Oh, the audio. So, that's the last thing that I need to do. So if I go back to my scene, I'll just click on one of them. I'll add component. I'll add an audio source. Okay. open that up, and then I have a My Audio folder here, and I have a power up sound. So I just go back, click on my Enemy Prefab here, and I'm going to drag, oops, no, I don't know which one it was. This one, I think, right? Yeah. So I'll drag the audio source into the audio clip there, then I'll hit apply, and now it will be for all of them. And so whenever one of them sees me, which will be right away, by the way, you'll hear a sound. And that's really important. You want to clue your player in to the fact that something is happening, right? You don't want an enemy just to sneak up on you and shoot you dead in one shot. Like, that's frustrating. So you can have this little sound or something to tell you that you've been detected. So that was the sound, and he's coming for me. Let's see what he does with the oh, apparently that one's not working. Oh, well, he's working. All right, well, apparently we have a problem. We'll have to figure that out, but you get the idea. That one's working. I'm not sure why the others aren't following me. Yeah, they're not triggering. So something's wrong with them, and I'll have to sort that out and why they don't have the same triggers. But we'll figure it out. The other one is working. So theoretically, with your prefab, you should be able to drag and drop new enemies all over your all over the map, and you'll be able to have them come and attack your character. If your enemy isn't supposed to shoot, if you want your enemy to like hurt your player on touch, then you take your minimum on the script. You take your minimum distance to 0, and you'll ignore the shooting part. Okay, so we'll have the shooting will equal true. That's fine, but we just won't ever call that in another script. So the script will function just fine, even if you don't have a shooting script. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I think we can probably get to work.